Throughout their history, from the Old Republic to the New, the Mandalorian proudly lived the way of the Mandalore. This was not an easy life. It was a culture that believed combat and the warrior's path defined who an individual was. The Mandalorians were not just governed by rules and political leaders. They followed a higher purpose, a heritage full of self-discipline that was forged in the chaos of war. And so for the Mandalorians, conflict was not a choice, but a rite of passage and a way of life. Hello there friends, welcome back to another episode of Generation Tech. My name is Alan. When new Mandalorians were first introduced to audiences, many, including myself, scoffed at the idea of pacifist Mandalorians. The very term seemed like an oxymoron because Mandalorians have always been defined by their militarist view of how one should live their life. Factions like the Death Watch probably saw these individuals as blasphemous heretics for their lack of armor and blasters. And even the more relaxed true Mandalorians were probably unsettled by their complete rejection of their cultural legacy. But if we take a deeper look at the Mandalorians' history and we remove all expectations from the equation, it becomes very apparent why these individuals would seek a more non-violent and pacifist route. So I looked at my YouTube viewer demographics and I found out that there aren't many viewers coming from the Mandalorian system, and I assume not many of our viewers know any Mandalorians in real life as well. And so most of us have very little first-hand experience with Mandalorians or Mandalorian culture, and most of us only know about Mandalorian culture through a very romanticized version of their history that we see in TV shows and films. The first Mandalorian who appeared on screen, Boba Fett, became an instant fan favorite amongst audiences. Expectations were that this group of helmeted individuals were made up of gruff, badass warriors who loved warfare and nothing else. As we learned more about the Mandalorian race, we saw a history that was defined more by battles and conquering of planets than it was through technological and social achievements or economic and political development. Which should have been a sign that there are some deeper issues plaguing these people. I mean, military victories are great, but they don't really feed your people or help boost your economy. The reality is, aside from force-sensitive groups, no other people have inflicted and taken more damage from the galaxy than the Mandalorian people, which is why a good portion of the galaxy actually have very negative views towards the Mandalorians. This is the consequence of having a warrior society that is led generally by the strongest fighter instead of, say, the wisest leader. And this trend started with the ancient progenitors of the Mandalorians known as the Twang, who were driven off of their homeworld of Notron. Despite their fearsome capabilities on the battlefield, they were outnumbered by the more industrious Zell and were defeated as a result. I mean, the Mandalorians were always very efficient at the tactical level, but they were usually outmatched at the strategic level, and this unfortunately would be a reoccurring theme throughout their history. Now, we've gone through the entire history of the Mandalorians several times already on this channel, from the First Crusade to the Great Sith War to the Neo-Crusader period and the Mandalorian Wars. Whenever Mandalore was prospering, it usually meant great periods of strife and brutality for entire swaths of the galaxy. This sort of helped build the legend that surrounded the Mandalorian warrior group. Many great songs are sung about these brave individuals who took a stand or performed great acts of courage and sacrifice. The Mandalorians even had an epic death ceremony known as the Kote Kiram, or Glory Death. This was usually reserved for the most heroic amongst their numbers, individuals who died surrounded by their foes or perhaps took out one of their hated rivals, the Jedi. It's quite common for warrior societies to have all sorts of cultural traditions and rites to bring more meaning to the death of fallen warriors. Otherwise, how could you convince the next generation to give their lives for this very dangerous pursuit? As outsiders, we tend to view these traditions as being meaningful and even cool, but without sacrificing anything ourselves, our views on these matters are relatively naive and unbalanced. Now, what we don't often see in Mandalorian culture is the other side, the suffering and all of the devastation wrought onto the Mandalorian people by their violent actions. I like to separate these factors into three different groups. First, we have the individual cost. Even though Mandalorians are well prepared and well protected in battle, they inevitably will take losses because of the sheer amount of conflict they're involved in. In many ways, those who perish are kind of the lucky ones, because you have a lot of individuals who are wounded both physically and mentally, and they no longer can fight for the rest of their days and require all sorts of aid and care. There's not much glory in having to depend on a caretaker to help you out of bed for the rest of your life to take a shit because half of your body was vaporized in an orbital bombardment. The Republic Commando series is actually one of the few entries in Star Wars which talks about this darker aspect of Mandalorian culture. In one story, the clone commando and technically foundling, Phi Skirata, took a Verpine shattergun round straight to the helmet. He was almost wrote off as dead by the Kaminoan Dolphinkin, but his brothers managed to bring him to a neurologist, and a friendly Jedi commander by the name of Barton Jusik managed to repair his brain with the Force. Now, Phi was one of the lucky ones. He would survive, albeit some major changes to his personality, bouts of depression, loss of speech abilities, loss of muscle control. But then again, he did have a family supporting him, and he found a Mandalorian girl, which really helped speed his recovery, and he would regain a lot of his functions later on in life. The second major cost that all Mandalorians have to bear is the desolation of their planet. Long ago in the past, Mandalore was actually a very wild and savage planet covered in farmland and forests. But then something terrible happened in 738 BBY. As the rest of the galaxy was trending towards demilitarization and peace, the Mandalorians were actually militarizing and heavily investing in military technology, which really freaked out the Republic. You gotta remember, Mandalore at this time was not a part of the Republic and was a neutral entity, more or less. This would actually result in a very morally questionable preemptive strike by the Republic led by the Jedi. Calling upon their judicial forces and several planetary security forces from the expansion region, the Republic managed to control the orbit around the planet and bombed the Mandalorians into submission. What was left was basically an irradiated landscape completely stripped of life. Future generations of Mandalorians would actually have to live in protective and self-contained habitation spheres. The third major tragedy that happened to all Mandalorians was when Mandalore the Ultimate lost a duel with the Jedi known as Revan. The Jedi would actually take the Mask of Mandalore, a symbol for unification in Mandalorian leadership, and hide it so that the line of succession would be broken. After this occurred, Mandalorian society would be scattered across the galaxy. They would be completely aimless and leaderless for many generations. Actually, the Mandalorians would never really unify in the numbers they did during the Crusade periods, which was probably good for the rest of the galaxy, but definitely not good for them. There's another deeper trauma hidden within the Mandalorian psyche. You see, Mandalorians are not inherently evil or associated to the dark side. Unfortunately, it is just the roles that they take in society that forces them to use violence all the time because they know no other way. During the Crusader periods, the Mandalorians carried out genocides against other species and in some cases wiped out entire species. For instance, in 2973 BBY, Cassius Fett led the Neo-Crusaders on an invasion of the world of Cathar. The Cathar were caught off guard by the invasion and quickly overwhelmed as the Mandalorians destroyed one settlement after another. In one famous incident, thousands of Cathar were driven into a shallow ocean and then incinerated. Over 4,000 years later, Mandalorian historian Wadi Tai was overheard in a conversation with a Kaminoan Jedi saying the following: "Everyone's got some dirt in their history, man. In the days of the Old Republic, we Mandalorians wiped out at least one sentient species just to prove that we could, the Cathar. Are we ashamed of that? I hope so. It shows us that beneath the Beskar, Mandalorians were just humans like the rest of us and not like Kaminoans, who are more like dolphins. And more importantly, humans, unlike dolphins, have a conscience, and I believe that many Mandalorians, especially when they were removed from the influence of the Sith, felt terrible about their past history and all of the suffering they caused. This is why when Satine Kryze sat down and developed her political ideology, she not only recognized the disastrous effect constant warfare had on the Mandalorian people, but also the terrible tragedy and pain her people inflicted on others. The new Mandalorians would go to battle against Death Watch and more traditional factions, and their battle cry was a cry for reform. Their main goal was to ultimately end Mandalorian militarism. And for all of us, including myself, who laughed at her and scoffed at the idea that a bunch of peace-loving hippies could defeat the Mandalorians, well, once again, these heavily armed warriors, despite being better fighters, were no match for the masses that the new Mandalorians had on their side. These were individuals who wanted something better, something less destructive. And so just like how the ancient Zelf threw off the shackles of oppression from the Tuang all those years back, the new Mandalorians would win the war. And shortly after, Satine Kryze would lead the new Mandalorians to build a new nation, one that was aligned with the principles of nonviolence. It would be a planet with a minimal security presence, with a heavy focus on rebuilding their broken planet and society. Satine Kryze would force the Mandalorians to look inwards towards their own brutal history so that they can learn from their past mistakes so that they would not repeat it in the future. This is where this painting comes from. It depicts one of the Mandalorian Crusader periods. This ability to reflect on one's past mistakes and horrible deeds is actually a rarity. It's even more rare for an entire society or government to do so. Oftentimes, it's easier to just forget or just rewrite history altogether. But facing one's horrific past is an important step in de-radicalization and eliminating more negative cultural norms in a society. It's definitely not the path for the faint at heart, and it takes a lot of courage to do so, but ultimately there are a lot of positive benefits to doing this. When I look at the new Mandalorians, I'm actually reminded by the German concept of Vergangenheitsbewältigung, which translates into struggling through the past. This process was adopted by the German state and society post-World War II after the fall of Hitler's Third Reich. It discusses the uneasy concept of collective guilt that is shared by the German people for their persecution or apathy in the face of the Nazi-orchestrated genocide of Jews, Gypsies, homosexuals, political prisoners, and other so-called enemies of the state during the Holocaust. There's also the collective shame of Germany's aggression against its neighbors, France, Poland, the USSR, and many other European nations. This painful process ultimately healed Germany and most of Europe in ways that no one could have imagined in 1945. And this is what Duchess Satine Kryze wanted for her people. But she was perhaps a bit too extreme, and the blood that covered the Mandalorians' hands was stained too deep to fully wash off. Also, Duchess Satine Kryze would fail in her most important duty as the head of a sovereign planet, and that was facilitating the protection of her people. Ultimately, greater forces far stronger than Mandalore would destabilize her world, leaving it open to criminals and thugs. So, as you can see, the new Mandalorians were actually very courageous. I wouldn't call them naive. I would instead call them quite extreme in their adoption of pacifism. They probably should have built a larger defense force, or a defense force, so that they would have some more leverage. Because ultimately, in a very chaotic part of the galaxy like where the Mandalorians were living, peace can only be achieved when you have some kind of threat of force. Well guys, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification button down below for more awesome content. As usual, my name is Alan, reminding you that my allegiance is to the Republic, to democracy.